I hope I printed enough of those. I stole 3 to make sure my kids have them, and wife. I don't know why I bring my Bible up. I guess I feel like I should because I don't use it right up here. But we just said a prayer, praying for James. PD had a prayer for a number of individuals. And today we're going to talk about what happens, and I didn't put the whole title up here, what happens when God answers no to our prayers. And I'm going to buy a little bit of time to let her pass that out, and I guess I failed to underline something on this sheet. But so the last 2 weeks we kind of finished with Esther and then kind of looked into the sovereignty of God, God being the creator, the possessor, the absolute ruler of heaven and earth. And then last week we looked at the fact that if God is sovereign, He's the ruler, He's the creator, He has everything, then do our prayers make a difference? Can we change the mind of God? And we concluded that our prayers do make a difference. And they make a difference because God commands us to pray. He expects us to pray. He exemplified for us to pray. And He plans for our prayers, just like He plans for the outcome of our prayers. We related that a little bit back to Esther, and Esther fulfilling her purpose, her plan that God had placed her within the Persian Empire's a leadership, but in the position that she was in as queen. But we ended both of those by saying, in all things, God's will be done. But have you ever prayed and have God answer your prayer with no? I would be willing to bet that all of us have. And if you have, I didn't know whether to put you're not alone or whether to put you're in good company. Because we're going to look this morning. I'm going to put all the Bible passages up here, but I'm going to go through a number of Bible passages relatively quick. Some of them I'm sure you're familiar with, and some of them you may not be as familiar with, where God answers no to a person's prayer. So the first one is Abraham. Back in Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 through 19, Abraham has been promised that his lineage is going to be blessed and there'll be a great nation coming from his lineage. But Abraham is a little, I don't want to say impatient, but he decides to take matters into his own hands, and he has a child with his wife's servant, and that child is Ishmael. So in Genesis 17, beginning in verse 15, it says, Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name, or Sarai, you should call her name Sarai or Sarah. I'm not sure how to pronounce the differences, but he changes her name. And he says, And I will bless her, and I will also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. King of peoples shall be from her. But notice what happens in verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Abraham fell on his face. He gets down on the ground, and he said in his heart, he doesn't say this out loud, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Anybody 100 years old? Joe, don't raise your hand. No thoughts back there, brother. And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Abraham looks at this and he says, God, I don't see how this is going to happen. So then he says, God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Now, I've read this a lot of times and I kind of miss this because what Abraham is saying is, God, we're too old to have kids. This isn't going to happen. But I have my son Ishmael, and Ishmael is probably a teenager or maybe 11, 12, 13, probably JR's age. And he says, why don't you bless him? Why don't you make my people great through him? he is, and I'm sure Abraham loves him. It's his son. It's his only son. But in verse 19, God says, no. What does he say no to? He says no to Abraham. He says, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. Sarah, your wife, is going to bear you a son, and you should call his name Isaac. Sarah, your wife, who is 90 years old, is going to bear you a son. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. Abraham wants Ishmael. God says no. It's going to be Isaac. Isaac, who doesn't even exist at this time. But God tells Abraham no. And then we look at Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 23 through 28, Moses had led the people of Israel for 40 years, and they're getting ready, just about to cross into the promised land. But God has told Moses, you're not going to lead the people in. Verse 23, Moses says, then I pleaded with the Lord at this time. Moses is pleading with God. He says, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven on earth who can do anything like the works and your mighty deeds? He's telling God how great he is. He's praising God. But in verse 25 he says, but I pray. God, I'm asking you. I'm pleading with you. I'm begging you. Let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains, and Lebanon. Verse 26. But the Lord was angry with me. Moses is writing this, and he's talking to the people on your account. God is angry with me, and he wouldn't listen to me. Have you ever felt like God was not listening to you? That you're praying, and God says, I don't want to hear it anymore. Because that's what he tells Moses. He says, enough. Speak no more to me of this matter. Don't beg me anymore to do this. I've already made up my mind. This is what's going to happen. But here's what I'll tell you. Verse 27. Go on to the top of this mountain. Lift up your eyes toward the west, to the north, to the south, and to the east. And behold it with your eyes. I'm not going to let you go in, but you can see it. And Joshua then takes over and leads the people into the promised land. But God tells Moses, stop. That's enough. The answer is no. David, in 2 Samuel 12, the last part of verse 15 and 18, David has a child with Bathsheba. And this child was conceived in sin. Because David had Bathsheba's husband killed. And in the last part of verse 15 it says, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David. Doesn't even say Bathsheba, but Uriah's wife. And Uriah, who's now dead. And the child became ill. Notice in verse 16, David, a man after God's own heart, David therefore pleaded with God for the child. And David fasted and lay all night on the ground. Talked last week about in James where it says that the effective fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. This is a fervent prayer. David is a righteous man, and he's laying on the ground and he's begging God for the life of his son. But in verse 17 it says, so the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the ground. This is the king who's on the ground. But he would not, nor would he eat any food that was given to them. Notice how long he does this. 7 days. You think David is praying night and day for the life of his child? And it came to pass that the child died. And the servants of David were so afraid to tell him that the child was dead, because they said, indeed, while the child was alive, we spoke to him and he would not heed our voice. How can we tell him now that the child is dead? He may do some harm. David was pleading with God, was begging with God, and the answer to David's prayer? says, no, David. No. What about Paul? I have this up here twice. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. The New King James says, and lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the reservations. I put the New Living Translation. To keep me from being proud, Paul said, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a message from Satan. The New King James says to buffet, but Satan says to, but the New Living says to torment. That word torment. Have you ever felt tormented about something? Have you just been really got down about something and you wonder, God, why is this happening to me? Why is Satan allowed to do this to me? Why do I feel this way? And Paul says, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. God, please, please, please take this away from me. And the response was, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul goes on then to thank God for that. But when God told me no, it said, Trey, my grace is all you need. My power is made best in weakness. I would have a hard time accepting that. Paul was told no. Moses was told no. David was told no. Abraham was told no. Can you think of too many other people in the Bible who are closer to God than those guys? Another one that I find very interesting. Acts chapter 12, 4 through 16. This part, there's no. But what's happening here is that Herod has gone around and he's arrested Peter. And he's put Peter into prison. And according to verse 4, he's got 4 squads of soldiers that are keeping to him. And in verse 5 it says, Peter was therefore kept in prison. But constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. God's people, the church, they were in another house, and we'll see this in a second. And they're praying and they're praying that God, please spare Peter. And when it came to pass, he said to them, now I know for certain that the Lord, he gets out of prison. The angels release him from prison. He gets out. I skipped some verses here for the sake of time. Peter gets out of prison. He realizes that he has been delivered from the hand of Herod. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where they were gathered together and where they were praying. So all of these Christians are together praying. Verse 13 said, and as Peter knocked on the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she didn't open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood at the gate, but you didn't open the gate. But they said to her, you're beside yourself. Why would they say that? Did they expect their prayer to be answered? They were praying and praying, but they didn't expect Peter to be at the door. You're beside yourself. But she says, no, he's there. I promise you he's there. So they said, no, it's not Peter, it's his angel. But Peter continued knocking. Peter didn't give up. And when they opened the door, they saw him, and notice, they were astonished. Why were they astonished that God had answered their prayer for Peter? Why would they feel that way? You know why? Because if we go to the first few verses of Acts chapter 12, it says, now about that time Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Do you think the Christians at this time would pray for Peter but not for James? I don't think so either. Renee's shaking her head. She's the only one agreeing with me. No! If James is in prison, don't you think that the Christians in the church are together and they're with each other and they're praying, God, please be with James, just like they're praying for Peter? But was their prayer answered for James? No. It wasn't. James was killed. And so when they're praying for Peter and God answers their prayer, it's almost like, wait, well, that's an answer to our prayer. Do you think while James was in prison, do you think he was praying for himself? I would be. I don't know what's going to happen, God. I'm in prison for being a Christian. But I pray that you'll be with me, God. And he's probably saying, God, your will be done. Just like the Christians might be. And maybe I should have flipped these. But God's answer to the prayer to spare James's life, the Bible doesn't say they're praying for that, but my assumption is God's answer to those prayers was no. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but Jesus, when Jesus was on this earth, he had three individuals that were the closest to him. Peter, James, and John. Why did James die? Why was James killed? Could God have saved James' life and not let him be beheaded? Of course. God could have done whatever he wanted to do. But he allowed James to be killed. Why did God allow James to die and Peter to live? I don't know. If one of the apostles was going to die, why not one of the other ones? It's not one of the inner circle of Jesus. I don't know. I don't think any of us have the answer to that prayer. We have no idea. But I will say this. When God says no, maybe the answer to our prayer, like it was to Abraham, was a partial no. No, it's not going to be Ishmael. I'm going to bless Ishmael also, but I've got a bigger and better plan, and that's Isaac. So it's not a full no, but it's a partial no. Or maybe when God says no to our prayers, it's like Moses. And he says no to what we're asking, but he provides us an alternative. You're not going to go to the promised land, but I'm going to let you see it. Or maybe when God answers no, it's because of our sin. And maybe God says, I'm forgiving you of your sin, like I forgave David, but I'm not going to relieve you of the consequences of your sin. You still have to live with those consequences. I'm not changing that. So maybe God says no because of sin. Or maybe when God says no to our prayers, it's like God responded to Paul and he says, Paul, I get you. I understand what you're going through, but guess what? My grace is sufficient for you. My love and my mercy and my grace are going to take care of you. This torment that you have from Satan, my grace is going to be good enough. So no, I'm not going to take it away. Or maybe, like James, like the church who I think were praying for James, God's no response, I don't know how to better word this, we just don't know. We don't, we have no understanding why God would say no to some situations. Defies comprehension for us as humans. But I want to go to one more instance where God said no. In Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 41. It says, Then Jesus came to them at a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter. It says two sons of Zebedee. These are James and John. James, who's about to die in just a short time after this. And he took with him Peter, James, and John. And he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And he said to them, to who? To Peter, James, and John. My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. Have you ever been so much in anguish and pain, that you're just reaching out and pleading with God. You're reaching out to your closest friends and you're saying, can you be with me? Can you stay with me? I'm just having such a difficult time right now. And Jesus in verse 39 went a little further. And Jesus also falls on his face. Jesus lays flat down and he starts praying, "Oh my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Jesus is saying, God, I don't really want to go through with this crucifixion. I'm going to, if it's your will, because I'm going to do what you asked me to do, but I'm pleading with you, God, if there's any other way that we can make this happen, I would rather not go through this. We don't know how long Jesus prays that prayer, but when he gets up, by the time he gets up, they're asleep. And he sees Peter and he says, "Peter, what? Couldn't you watch with me for 1 hour?" What's the implication there? How long was Jesus praying laying on the ground? An hour. Seems like. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And it continues on in Matthew in 26:42. So again, the second time, Jesus went out and he prayed. He's already prayed for an hour. But he says, "Oh my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." If there is no other way that we can make this work, then your will be done. We don't know how long he prayed this time, but he came back and he found that they were still asleep. Luke, the physician Luke, in 22:44 says, "And being in agony," this is Jesus, this is the Son of God, "he prayed more earnestly." Have you ever prayed earnestly for something? Begging and pleading with God? Have you ever prayed so much that your sweat became like drops of blood? That physically happened to Jesus. We may feel like it happens to us sometimes when we're crying and we're begging and we're pleading with God. But they're not listening. The other people are not paying attention, so he left them. Jesus goes away and he prays a third time, saying the same words, pleading with God. And then he came to his disciples and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and you resting?" The people who he had trusted for the last 3 years of his life have let him down. But he wakes them up and he says, "Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let's be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Jesus knows, and Jesus knew, that even though he was praying so earnestly and fervently before God, that the answer to his prayer was no. God's answer to his own Son was no. And when Jesus hung on the cross, and when Jesus cried out, it's finished, after Jesus had went through all of the pain and the suffering that he went through, God had allowed his Son to suffer and die one of the most horrific deaths possible. And there's no way I can answer this question, and I don't know if I should even ask this question. Or I should word it, how difficult was it for God to see his Son suffering, knowing that he had the power to stop it right then? And God said no. God said no to his own Son when his Son is suffering and dying on the cross. And when I think about that, and when I think about some of the things that I pray for, if God would say no to his own Son in a situation like that, my prayers are pretty petty sometimes. But Jesus' apostles and his disciples, all of those who followed Jesus, were completely devastated when Jesus died. Everything that they had hoped for. They had been waiting for the Messiah, and they thought that the Messiah was going to come and free them from the bondage of Roman rule. They had hoped, their dreams, everything was going to be fulfilled in this man Jesus, and now he's dead. But I'll ask you a question. Do you think the disciples prayed for Jesus when he was arrested? If I saw Jesus being taken away and I saw Judas leading him away with the soldiers, I would be praying for Jesus. Do you think when Jesus is on the trial, we know Peter's around, we think John is probably around watching what's taking place. The other 10 are probably in hiding, well 9 are in hiding someplace else. Do you think they're praying for Jesus? Do you think if they're in hiding, or if they see Jesus being whipped or beaten or abused, or if they saw Jesus on the cross, do you think they were praying for Jesus? I would say yes. And God said no. He said no to all of them. And they could not understand why God said no. When Jesus is dead on Friday night and Saturday and Sunday morning, do you think they were crying? Shedding tears? Hurt? Upset? I'm sure they were. But there's going to be times when we don't understand why God says no to our prayers. But God knew what he was doing then, and God knows what he's doing now. God allowed his son to die, to physically die on the cross. God allowed his son to go through everything that he went through. God said no to his son so that each one of us could live. So that we could have that spiritual life, and we can only have that because his son shed his blood for us. The cleansing power of Jesus' blood forgives us of our sins. Jesus died for us, and God said no to his son for us. And because God said no, we have an opportunity for salvation. We have an opportunity for true life and true everlasting life. Just like Jesus' disciples, there are times when we don't understand why God says no to our prayers. I put all of this up there in writing because I wasn't sure if I would be able to read it all or say it all without stopping. But there's going to come a time, there's going to come a day, and it may not be in this life where we understand why God says no. Maybe in the future we'll look back and we'll say, God, thank you for saying no to that prayer that I really wanted, because things have turned out so much better. But there also may not be ever a time on this earth where we ever get the answer to why God said no. But I firmly believe when we get to heaven someday, we'll have that perfect understanding, that perfect peace, that perfect love, that perfect comfort that only can come from God. And at that point, we may not care why God said no, because we're in his presence. But for now, as we live this life, we have to walk, we have to live by faith. That word, faith, in Greek is pistis, I guess. And in other areas and in other ways, that word can be translated as trust or confidence. So we walk in faith, or we walk in trust. We walk in confidence. And I put this here because when God says no to our prayers, not if God says no to our prayers, but when God says no to our prayers, we have to have the faith, we have to have the trust, we have to have the confidence that the sovereign God of the universe knows what He is doing. He knows what's best. We have to realize that He knows what He's doing, He knows what's best, and that He loves us absolutely. And that He would never do anything purposely to hurt us or purposely to get us to not have faith or trust in Him. And it's hard. But we have to have faith. We have to have trust in the will of God. And we have to put that faith or that trust into action. We have to live that way. And maybe this is more for me and not for you. But when God says no, we can't mope around, we can't complain, we can't cry, we can't say, well, forget it, God doesn't love me anymore, or God doesn't care about me anymore. Or we can't sit around wondering why God would say no. But we have to put our faith and our trust that God knows what He's doing, and we live completely trusting Him. And we can trust in God. We can put our faith in God. Because God said no to Abraham, to Moses, to David, to Paul, to James, and to His own Son. Because God's plan is better than our plan. God's will is better than our will. And we have to allow God to be God. Maybe this sermon was more for me than most everybody else. It wasn't a sermon to reach out to those who were lost. And maybe if Joey is listening, Joey, who worshipped here, he said many, many years ago, he called last night. And hopefully he's listening, and hopefully it means a little something to him. But if there's anything we can do to help you in your spiritual journey, or if you need to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, we always have an invitation song as Rusty reads us in that invitation.